Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Hello guys, here I will present to you about teaching listening. This is the definition of teaching listening. The importance of listening in language learning can hardly be overestimated in the classroom. Students always do more listening than speaking. Listening competence is universally larger than speaking competence. Listening comprehension has not always drawn the attention of educators to extent that it now has. Perhaps human being has a natural tendency to look at speaking as major index of language proficiency. In the decades of the 1950s and 60s, language teaching methodology was preoccupied with the spoken language, and classrooms full of the students could be heard performing their oral drill. It was it was not uncommon for students to practice phrases they didn't even understand orally. The next one is listening comprehension in pedagogical research. Listening as a major component in language learning and teaching first hit the spotlight in the late 1970s with James Arthur's 1977 work on total physical response. In TVR, the role of comprehension was given prominence as learners were given great quantities of language to listen to before they were encouraged to respond orally. The second is Stephen Krashen, 1985. For example, borrowing insight from first language acquisition stressed the significance of comprehensive input or the oral reception of language that is just a little beyond the learner's present ability. At the same time, researchers were also stressing the crucial importance of whatever mental processes will put to bear on the learners, converting input into intake or that which is stored in the learner's competence. Subsequent pedagogical research on listening comprehension made significant refinements in the process of listening. Studies looked at the effect of several different contextual characteristics and how they affect the speed and efficiency of processing oral language. Rubin 1994 identified five such factors like text, interlocutor, task, listener, and process characteristics. In each case, important elements of the listening process were identified. All of these issues prompt teachers to consider some specific questions about listening comprehension. The first is what are listeners doing when they listen? The second is what factors affect good listening? The third is what are the characteristics of real life listening? The fourth is what are the many things listener for listen? The fifth, what are some principles for designing listening technique? The sixth is how can listening technique be interactive? And the last is what are some common technique for teaching listening? This is the question about listening comprehension. An interactive model of listening comprehension adapted from Clark and Clark 1977 and Richard 1963. Listening is not a one-way street. First step of listening comprehension is the psychomotor process of receiving sound waves through the ear and transmitting nerve impulses to the brain. There, there are the following eight processes adapted from Clark and Clark 1977 and Richard 1963 that are involved in comprehension. The first one is the hearer processes what we'll call raw speech and holds an image of it in short-term memory. This image consists of the constituent like phrases, clauses, cohesive markers, intonation, and stress patterns of a stream of speech. The second is the hearer determines the type of speech being processed. For example, a conversation, a speech, a radio broadcast, and then appropriately colors the interpretation of the perceived message. The third is the hearer infers the objective of the speaker through consideration of the type of speech, even the context and the content. For example, one determines whether the speaker wishes to persuade, request, exchange pleasantries, affirm, deny, inform, and so forth. Thus, the function of the message is inferred. The fourth is the hearer recalls background information relevant to the particular context and subject matter. A lifetime of experiences and knowledge is used to perform cognitive associations to bring a plausible interpretation to the message. The fifth is the hearer assigns a literal meaning to the utterance. This process involves a set of semantic interpretation of the surface strings that the ear has perceived. For example, when you're a teacher and you ask to your student, do you have time? It means that, do you possess enough time to answer me? And when you in the bus and you meet the stranger and the stranger asks you, do you have time? Your answer is yes or no, or it can be it's a quarter to nine or whether. It means that second language learner must in such case learn to go beneath the surface of such language to interpret correctly. The sixth is the hearer assigns an intended meaning to the utterance. The same question can be having different meaning. In some cases, like do you have time, when it says to the different people. A key to human communication is the ability to match perceived meaning with the intended meaning. This matchmaking, of course, can extend well beyond simple, metaphorical, and idiomatic language. It can apply to short and long stretches of discourse, and its breakdown can be caused by careless speech, inattention of the hearer, conceptual complexity, contextual issues, psychological barriers, and a host of other performance variables. The seventh is that hearer determines whether information should be retained in short-term or long-term memory. Short-term memory, a matter of a few seconds, is appropriate in contexts that call for a quick oral response from the hearer. Long-term memory is more common when, say, you are processing information in a lecture. There are, of course, many points in between. The last is the hearer deletes the form in which the message was originally received. The word, phrases, and sentences are quickly forgotten and pruned in 99% of speech act. It should be clear from the foregoing that listening comprehension is an interactive process. The 8 processes are relevant to a learner's purpose for listening, to performance factors that may cause difficulty in processing speech, to overall principles of effective listening technique, and to the choices you make of what technique to use and when to use them in your classroom. Next is type of spoken language. The classification of types of oral language shown in figure 16.1 should enable you to see the big picture of what teaching oral comprehension entails. There are 2 types. The first is monologue and the second is dialogue. In monologue, one speaker uses spoken language for any length of time, such as speeches, lectures, readings, new broadcasts, and the like. The hearer must process long stretches of speech without interruption. The stream of speech will go on whether or not the hearer comprehends. The first is planned monologue, usually manifests little redundancy and are therefore relatively difficult to comprehend. The second is unplanned monologues exhibit more redundancy, which makes them easy in comprehend, but the presence of more performance variables and other hesitations can either help or hinder comprehension. The second is dialogues. Dialogues involves two or more speakers and can be subdivided into those exchanges that promote social relationship or interpersonal, and those for which the purpose is to convey propositional or factual information, or it can be transactional. The difference are that in the latter, the hearer is, as in monologues, unable to interrupt or otherwise participate vocally in the negotiation, meaning similarly like familiar participants may share very little common knowledge on a particular topic. If each category then is viewed as endpoint, you can aim your teaching at appropriate range in between. One is what makes listening difficult. The following 8 characteristics of spoken language are adapted from several sources: Tonko 1991 and Richards 1983 or 1984. The first one is clustering. Clustering is we break down the speech into smaller groups of words. In teaching listening comprehension, therefore, you need to help students to pick out manageable clusters of words. Sometimes second language learners will try to retain overly long constituents, or they will err in the other direction in trying to attend to every word in an utterance. The second is redundancy. The next time in a conversation, notice refreshing, repetition, elaboration, and little insertion of I mean and you know. Learners can train themselves to profit from such redundancy by first becoming aware that not every new sentence or phrase will necessarily contain new information, and by looking for the signals of redundancy. The next one is reduced form. The reduction can be phonological, like chat yet for did you eat yet, and chimeo, like correct me if I'm wrong, and for morphological contraction like I'll, syntactic, for example, elliptical form like when will you be back, and the answer is tomorrow, maybe, or phlegmatic. The example is phone rings in the house and child answer and yells to another room in the house, mom found. Okay, the fourth is performance variables. In spoken language, except for plain discourse, speeches, lectures, and etc., hesitations, false starts, pauses, and correction are common. Learners have to train themselves to listen for meaning in the midst of distracting performance variables. The fifth is colloquial language. Learners who had studied the standard was written English or textbook language sometimes find it difficult to deal with colloquial language like an idiom, slang, reduced form, and shared cultural knowledge are all manifested at some points in conversation. The sixth is rate of delivery. Jack Richards, 1983, points out that the number of lengths of pauses used by a speaker are more crucial to comprehension than sheer speed. Learners will nevertheless eventually need to be able to comprehend language delivered at varying rates of speed and at times delivered with few pauses. The seventh is stress, rhythm, and intonation. English is difficult for some learners because English is a stress-timed language. The intonation patterns are very significant, not just for interpreting straightforward elements such as questions, statements, and emphasis, but for understanding more subtle messages like sarcasm, endearment, insult, solicitation, praise, and etc. The last is interaction. I learned to listen, and the student need to study conversation, because with study conversation, the students can study the roles of interaction like negotiation, clarification, attending signals, turn taking, topic nomination, maintenance, and termination. The next one is micro skills of listening comprehension. Jack Richards in 1983 in his seminal article on teaching listening skills provided a comprehensive taxonomy of oral skills involved in conversation discourse. Such a list is very useful in helping to effective listening strategies. These micro skills can become testing criteria. Table 61 is just such a checklist adapted from Richards and other sources. It is important to note that these micro skills apply to conversational discourse. This is the table 61. The micro skills of listening comprehension adapted from Richards 1983. The first one is retain chunks of language of different lengths in short-term memory. The second is discriminate among the distinctive sound of English. The third is recognize English stress patterns, words in stressed and unstressed position, rhythmic structure, intonation, contours, and their role in signaling information, and etc. You can read by yourself. The next one is types of classroom listening performance. The first one is reactive. This role of listener are merely a tape recorder, adapted from Nona 1991b. Page 18 is very limited because the listener is not generating meaning. This role can play in the interactive classroom in brief choral or individual drills that focus on pronunciation. The second is intensive. Intensive is the technique that focuses components like phoneme, word intonation, discourse markers, and etc. An example of intensive listening performance like student listen focus in certain choral or individual drills. The third is responsive. Responsive is a significant proportion of classroom listening activities consisting of short stretches of teacher language designed to elicit immediate response. The example are asking questions. How are you today? What did you do last night? The another example is the second is giving commands, close the door, seeking clarification, pardon, checking comprehension like so how many people were in the elevator when the power went out? The fourth is selective. Selective listening differs from intensive listening in the discourse is in relatively long length. The examples are speeches, media broadcasts, stories, and anecdotes, conversation in which learners are eavesdroppers. And next is extensive. The extensive performance aims to develop a top-down global understanding of spoken language. This performance may require the student to invoke other interactive skills like note-taking or discussion for full comprehension. The sixth is interactive. There is a listening performance that can include all five above types, as learners actively participate in discussions, debates, conversation, role-play, and other peer and group work. The next one, the next one is principles for designing listening technique. The first one in an interactive for skills curriculum, make sure that you don't overlook the importance of technique that specifically develop listening comprehension competence. The creation of effective listening technique requires studied attention to all the participants of listening already summarized in this chapter. The second is use techniques that are intrinsically motivating. Appeal to listeners' interests and goals. An important factor in listening is background information such as experience, goals, and abilities of your student design lesson. Teachers need to try to construct the new technique that caught off with the activity and feel self-proposed by the student. The third is utilize authentic language and context. Teachers need to introduce natural text rather than concocted artificial material to make students readily dive into the activity of long-term goal. The fourth is carefully consider the form of listener responses. Adapted from La 1990, offered 9 different ways to check listener comprehensions. The first is doing the listener respond physically to a comment. The second is choosing the listener selects from alternatives such as pictures, object, and text. The third is transferring the listener draws a picture of what is heard. The next is answering the listener answer a questions about the message. The next is condensing the listener outlines or text note on a lecture. The next is duplicating. The listener translates the message into the native language or repeats it verbatim. The next is modeling. The listener orders a meal, for example, after listening to a model order. The last is conversing. The listener engage in a conversation that indicates appropriate processing of information. The fifth is encourage the development of listening strategies. Strategies for effective listening can become a highly significant part of their changes for successful learning. Teachers need to draw their attention to the value of such strategies or looking for keyword, looking for nonverbal cues meaning, predicting a speaker's purpose by the context of the spoken discourse, associating information with one's existing cognitive structure like activating background information, questioning at meaning, seeking clarification, listening for the general guess, various task-taking strategies for listening comprehension. Next is include both bottom-up and top-down listening technique. According to Morley, 1991, speech processing theory distinguishes between two types of processing input, listening and reading. They are bottom-up, the processing process from sounds to word to grammatical relationship to lexical meanings, and etc. to a final message. This technique is focused on sound, words, intonation, grammatical structures, and other components of spoken language. The second is top-down. Top-down is processing is evoked from a bank of prior knowledge and global expectation. This strategy is focuses on the activation of schemata, deriving meaning, global understanding, and an interpretation of text. Okay, here the listening technique from beginning to advanced, adapted from Person 1991, page 140, 114 till 121. This is for beginning level listener. You can you can read by yourself. This is also for beginning listeners. The next one is for intermediate level listeners. You can read by yourself from the bottom up exercises, top down exercises, and interactive exercises. Okay, this is the last for advanced level learners. You can read by yourself from bottom up exercises, top down exercises, and interactive exercises. Okay, that's all from me. Thanks for your attention. I'm sorry if I have one or more mistakes. See you and wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.